It seems like no one can agree on how to interpret this book. I'm talking about The Vegetarian by the South Korean author Han Kang, who won the Nobel Prize in 2024. So I've read a ton of different reviews on this book, and it convinced me that most people, even professional critics, don't actually know how to read deeply. In this video, I'm going to explain why almost everyone is wrong about this book and why I wouldn't have given Han Kang the Nobel Prize based on it. By the way, I have an extra video on my Patreon where you can find additional thoughts on this book, and I also comment on the translation because I do know some Korean, and I also consulted my Korean parents. Also, I just launched my book club on there. Okay, so just to give a brief spoiler-free summary of The Vegetarian, the book is in 3 parts. The first part is told from the point of view of a man, and it starts with him describing his wife. He says that she's unremarkable in every way, but this suits him just fine because honestly, he's too insecure to be with someone who's too attractive. My alarm bells about this book started ringing even on the first page because this character was clearly an insecure type of person, but he was also strangely very self-aware. Self-aware enough to talk about the inferiority complex he has about the size of his penis. And let me tell you, from what you read about this character and the rest of the book, he does not seem like the kind of guy who would admit to having an inferiority complex of any kind. So my alarm bells started to ring here because something about this sounded like it was coming from the point of view of a woman, and in particular a woman who had low opinion of men in general. In other words, this man sounded like a caricature of a toxic male. So the man's wife, her name is Young Hye, and she decides one day to become a vegetarian. And when her husband asks her why, she says she had a dream. This starts a whole series of disruptions, and she gets really skinny. Her family can't understand why she won't eat meat, and a whole lot of drama ensues. In the second and third parts of the book, we still follow the story of Young Hye, but told through different points of view. In the second part, the focus is on Young Hye's brother-in-law. It turns out he's very attracted to her. He's obsessed with her. In the third and final part, we get to see things from the point of view of Young Hye's sister. Interestingly, we never see things from the point of view of Young Hye herself. The closest we come to that are sections in the first part where we get some of her dreams and thoughts. The book has been described as surreal or Kafkaesque. It's been compared to Kafka's story, The Hunger Artist, as well as Herman Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener. By the way, on my Patreon, there's also a separate video comparing this book to both of those stories, as well as separate review videos for each story. I'll just tell you that I also happen to disagree with a lot of common interpretations of both of those stories. I'm not trying to be contrarian for its own sake. I just think that the world of literature is just filled with people who have certain ideologies or modern biases, and they'll read literature through that lens, like reading anti-capitalism into things when it's not really there, things like that. Okay, so what did reviewers or critics say about The Vegetarian? Lots of reviews said that this book was an indictment of patriarchal society in Korea. Here were some things that reviewers said, so you can pause the video if you want to read those. So why did people say this? There are multiple reasons. Pretty much all the major male characters in this book are horrible. Young Hye's husband, brother-in-law, and father are all awful in their own ways. In fact, they're almost cartoonishly awful. If you read this book and didn't know anything about Korean culture, you would get the impression that it's a lot more patriarchal than it actually is. Just a reminder, South Korea has actually had a female president. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do think Korean culture is a bit more patriarchal than most Western cultures. However, I don't know what society she's representing here in this book because the men in the family of this book, I don't think that they're typical. So for sure, the theme of patriarchy is pretty obvious in this book, and she even hits you over the head with it. But anyone who says that this book is mainly about patriarchy hasn't really read the book closely enough. And some things that the author has said in interviews will back this up. So, for example, she said, "If I could say one thing, this novel isn't a singular indictment of the Korean patriarchy." In another interview, she was asked, "Does it frustrate you that critics insist on reading it through the lens of Korean patriarchy?" Her answer, "It does, somewhat. If we confine the novel to an analysis of Korean patriarchy, we narrow it too much. We lose its other layers. There is, of course, a woman's voice in the novel, a silent cry, but that voice must be read alongside its other dimensions." From other things that the author has said, it seems like what she wanted to touch on with this book was whether humans can ever truly reject the violence within themselves. So, for example, in one interview, she has said, "The novel operates on several levels, but its central question is this: can human beings ever truly reject the violence that lives within them? By the way, just because a writer says what a book was intended to be doesn't mean that she has succeeded in executing what she intended. So I don't bring this up as some kind of proof that the book is about what the author says it is, but just as extra context. But in this case, I do think that there is a lot in the book that exhibits this theme of violence in humanity, and it's not just limited to men. So, for example, Young-hye herself is afraid of some kind of innate cruelty within herself. In some of her dreams, she's committing violence to others or animals, and she expresses fear of this different person rising up inside of her. She's afraid of herself. In another dream, she witnesses cruelty to animals and doesn't care. And something that happens at the end of the first part of the book, I won't go into it because I don't want to spoil it, but it also has to do with this thing that's part of her that she's afraid of. As the book progresses, she isn't just vegetarian, but she eventually stops eating altogether and tries to become a plant. And in doing this, it seems like Young-hye is trying to reject what she sees as her innate violent nature. She no longer wishes to be human. On a side note about this theme, something about it didn't resonate with me. I mean, of course, violence is horrible, but we all know that. This book has a lot of violence in it, and it's as if it expects us to gasp at that, at how horrible that is. But what is so profound about that? So I thought it was kind of a shallow take on the theme. Also, humans are not the only ones who are violent. Lots of animals eat other animals. Some will even torture other animals. I'm almost certain my cat would. I mean, she isn't skilled enough to catch anything, but if she could, she'd probably play with it to death. Some animals also engage in cannibalism and rape, or even go to war with rival groups of their own species. So why are humans singled out here? Isn't the problem nature itself? This actually brings me to a broader point, and it has to do with modern literature in general. I often detect a kind of self-hatred in it, hating humans, I mean, and singling them out when the cruelty is in nature too. I'm not saying we should hate nature too, but maybe if you're only dwelling on human cruelty, you have a warped view of things. To move on to some other themes in the novel, the author has also said, I think this novel has some layers, questioning human violence and the impossibility of innocence, defining sanity and madness, the impossibility of understanding others, body as the last refuge or the last determination, and some more. Again, a reminder, just because these are what the author says her book is about doesn't mean that she has succeeded in what she intended. Let's talk about one of the things she talks about here, defining sanity and madness. From what I can gather, based on things she's said and what others have said about the book, this has to do with asking questions like, who's the one who's actually insane? The person who rejects cruelty, like Young-hye, or the rest of society who casually accept everyday cruelty? Some of them also appear insane, or at least unhinged, because of how strongly they react against Young-hye's vegetarianism. For example, there's a scene where Young-hye's father is trying to force her to eat meat, and he tries to shove a piece of pork down her throat, and when she resists, he slaps her. So yeah, maybe on one level, Young-hye is crazy, especially later on as she stops eating altogether and says that she wants to be a plant. But are the people who conform to society also insane in a sense because of how easily they accept cruelty around them? But here's the thing. If you're critiquing or making a statement about a society, but your portrayal of that society is unrealistic or caricatured, well, then who are you actually critiquing? What I mean is, the father's response, it's not typical. I mean, Koreans like meat. My impression is that they see it as nutritious. Maybe it comes from generations of having been poor for so long up until relatively recently. Plus, I mean, they're right, it is nutritious. My mom has always said that you have to eat some meat to be strong. But actually, I don't think they're eating that much meat either, because there might be a little bit of meat at each meal, or fish, but the ratio of meat to other stuff is actually kind of low. The bulk of the food is actually rice and vegetables. But as I was saying, the reactions that the people have in this book to Young-hye's vegetarianism, they were exaggerated. So if this is supposed to be a statement or something about society, well, which society are you actually making a statement about? It's similar to what I was saying about how she handled the theme of patriarchy. The way the society was portrayed in this book was incredibly exaggerated. What mythical patriarchal society is this book portraying? So this makes me suspect that the outsized reactions that the people have in this book to her vegetarianism were there just to make the book more entertaining or extreme. And I like to be entertained as much as anyone else, but it feels a bit cheap. And also in this case, it just makes the book kind of irrelevant to anything real. So going back to the themes, as far as the other themes go, I'm not so sure that all of them came through in the novel, or sometimes there were hints of them, but I'm not sure how successful she was in exhibiting them in a way that was discernible to other people. Maybe that's because she just wants to pose questions rather than answer them. And she has said things along those lines in interviews. And I think that's fine, but having all these multiple different themes there, often in a very skeletal form, it can muddy the waters. I think that's part of the reason why so many people had such different interpretations of this book or were confused on how to read this book. So if you read this book and were confused, well, maybe it's not you, and maybe that's on the author. Having said that, although I could understand being confused about this book, a lot of reviewers, at least outwardly, didn't express confusion, but seemed to have a more certain view of what the book was about. And I think a lot of them were just not accurate. Here were some things that different reviewers said that they thought the book was about. Now, there were elements of these things in the book, but by no means were they the main themes. Because saying the book was mainly about any of these things just ignored too many other things about this book. So reading these reviews made me realize that so many people, even professional critics, don't seem to know how to read. I mean, of course, they can read at the level of sentences and paragraphs and regurgitate the plot of the novel, or pick up on things that recur so they can pick up on some themes. But there's another level of judging work, and that has to do with judging it as a piece of art, as a deliberately engineered system, in which every formal choice must justify its existence in relation to the whole. I also think that a lot of people, including professional critics, they're not confident enough as readers to question things when a highly praised author is failing. So they think it's not possible for the Nobel Prize Committee to be wrong. It is possible, by the way. Now, I think part of the reason so many people had different interpretations of this book is because it was uneven and actually kind of a mess. And maybe part of the reason for that was how this book was written. So something that I learned about the writing of this book was that it was originally published as 3 separate novellas in Korea. Apparently, she wrote the first 2 parts of the story together over 2 years, and then they were published. Then much later, she wrote the 3rd part. Now, when I learned this made sense to me because the book didn't feel very cohesive as a whole. I mean, sure, all 3 sections have recurring characters, and we are seeing what happens to Young-hae over time with each new section. But it didn't cohere in the way of a true masterwork where every word and scene is there for a good reason. There were other ways in which I felt like this book was a bit of a mess. For example, and again, I don't want to spoil what happens after the first section of this book, but there's a sort of shocking thing that happens at the end of that first section. And in the later sections of the book, it's as if that thing had never happened. We never refer back to it. There are no hints of it later on. I had other nitpicks about this book, like inconsistencies in voice. Again, you can find a longer discussion of that on my Patreon video. The writer Tim Parks, who wrote a review of this book, he also noticed other examples like this. You can read his article if you're curious about that. He also said that the sections in part 1 where we see Young-hae's violent, bloody dreams, that they were like bad horror writing, very cliched and melodramatic. And I have to say, I agree with him there. And despite how bloody and violent some of those were, I found them to be the most boring parts of the book, maybe because the writing was so terrible. Parks also picked apart the language, although there it's hard to know how much of that was because of the translation. Now, it may seem like I hated everything about this book based on what I've said so far, but there were things that I liked. In the first part of the book, for example, there's a part where Young-hae and her husband are at a gathering with his work colleagues. And there were a lot of awkward moments at that event, not just because she wasn't eating much food, but because she wasn't wearing a bra, so people were staring at her. That scene was deliciously uncomfortable. We could have had an entire novel based on that scene alone. I also felt like there were a lot of bizarre, interesting moments in the second section of the book, and that section was a page turner, so I enjoyed those parts. However, fundamentally, there was something about the book that felt false to me. I guess I just don't see the world in the way that Han Kang does. Or let me put it this way. A great writer can make you understand how they see the world, even if you started off seeing it very differently from them. But she didn't do that here, at least not for me. The way that she saw the world felt overly pessimistic about human nature. In interviews, she says that this book was about both violence and beauty in humans, but the main thing that came across to me was the violence. My main issue was that it was a work of melodrama. Melodrama relies on exaggerated emotions, sensational plots, and cartoonish villains to manipulate its audience. So yeah, I didn't love the book. I would recommend it to people who like this kind of thing, works that are surreal, graphic, weird. But would I give the Nobel Prize to this author if I were basing it only on this book? No. I mentioned Tim Parks earlier. His review was the only one that I thought was pretty much spot on. In that review, he says that there's this shared vision of what critics like in global fiction or books that get popular on a global level. And this book checks a lot of the right boxes. For example, it champions some individual against an oppressive society. It's especially trendy when that individual is a woman or a black or brown person. Another box to check, according to Tim Parks, is that emotionally it allows us to feel sympathy for a helpless victim, which is always encouraging for our self-esteem. And aesthetically, it offers moments of surrealism, which is seen as exotic and a guarantee of a lively imagination. It also helps that there are erotic elements in the book. So yeah, it checks off a lot of those boxes. My cat also has something to say about this book. The only thing she has to say is that she can't understand why anyone would want to be a vegetarian. If you like this review and want to join me in more bookish discussions, you can join my book club on my Patreon. There's more book reviews on there as well. Thanks for watching.